Just before sunrise, the river goes quiet, and somewhere along that water, men used to lose everything they had, sometimes in a single night, sometimes one hand at a time, slow enough they didn't notice it happening. And more often than not, it led back to one man, George Devol. They called him the greatest gambler to ever work the Mississippi, a card player, a con man, and a man who knew how to separate people from their money without ever raising his voice. Now, most gamblers, they drift. They come in loud, burn through a little luck, and disappear just as quickly. But Devol, he lingered, like a story that didn't quite know how to end. He wasn't born into cards or dice, not really. Ohio, early 1800s, grew up around the river trade, boats, cargo, and men trying to make something out of not much. Most of them didn't. The usual kind of beginnings that don't hint at anything remarkable. But somewhere along the way, he found gambling, or maybe gambling found him. And once it did, it didn't let go. He started young, too young probably. Learned quick too, which is always a dangerous combination. One of the first boats he worked was called the Cicero. That's where he picked up 7-Up and something more useful than the rules: bluffing. Not the kind you see now, loud, obvious, desperate. The quieter kind, the kind that doesn't look like anything at all. He watched the older men, the ones who dressed a little better, spent a little freer, and never seemed too concerned about losing a hand here or there. By the time he left that boat, he could deal seconds, palm a card clean, and put the deck back together in a way that didn't invite questions. Back in Ohio, before the river really claimed him, he'd already made a habit of winning. Faro, rondo, games that require wit. Faro tables moved quick. Hesitation cost you more than pride. Cards flipped from a dealing box, bets riding on a single turn. You could win in seconds, lose even faster. Rondo wasn't much kinder. Less noise, same result. And if a man at the table knew how to deal seconds or nudge a card just enough on the draw, well, the game could lean without anyone quite proving why. Devol took to them early, and worse, he took to them well. By 17, he'd already walked away with close to $3,000, enough to head back home with gifts in his bag and a version of himself his family probably didn't recognize. That was just the beginning. By the time most men were still figuring out what they were good at, Devol had already found something that paid him for understanding people better than they understood themselves. And it paid him plenty. Hundreds of thousands of dollars by his own account before the Civil War ever settled over the country. Money that didn't come all at once, but in a steady, patient accumulation, hand by hand, man by man. That's around the time things started to settle in. There's something about early wins that settles into a man's bones, makes him think the world might be a little softer than it really is. I've seen that look before, had it myself once or twice. That quiet belief that maybe you've got a touch of something special until the table reminds you otherwise. But Devol, he held on to that feeling longer than most. He used to say his skull was thick enough to headbutt a bull and make it think twice about its life choices. It became his signature move, the Devol butt. By the time he was a young man, the river had a way of keeping him where he was, and he didn't seem in any hurry to leave. Riverboats became his home, floating casinos before the term even meant anything. These weren't the polished floors and bright lights you see today. These were rough places, smoke thick enough to chew, money changing hands faster than anyone could properly count, and a constant undercurrent of tension humming beneath everything. And right in the middle of it sat Devol. He wasn't flashy. That's the first thing people noticed. No rings catching the light, no loud opinions, no need to prove anything to anyone sitting across from him. Just a man who played and stayed. Folks who knew the river would say George Devol was the finest gambler it ever carried, though that word never quite covered the whole of him. He could play cards, sure, better than most, but he could also lie clean when it suited him. Fighting came with the work, not every night, but often enough that a man learned quick. He got comfortable with that, too. Comfortable enough with a gun that he didn't hesitate when things turned. That's usually how it happens. Not in one big moment. Just a long series of small decisions that don't feel like much until you look back and realize what they added up to. Famous frontier figures started to circle him. Canada Bill Jones, Bill Rollins, Big Alexander. Gamblers who lived the same kind of life, drifting, dealing, taking what the moment offered, and moving on before anything caught up to them. It wasn't a friendly trade, not really, but there was an understanding among them, a kind of quiet agreement about what the game was and what it wasn't. Devol had his own way of moving through it. He liked to play against ministers. Now that might sound strange at first, but ministers carried something to the table most gamblers didn't. Certainty. They believed in things, in fairness, in order, in the idea that if you sat down and played honestly, the outcome would follow something close to reason. Devol let them believe that. He'd take their money the same as anyone else, slow, steady, without drawing attention to it, and once it was done, once the lesson had settled in, he'd hand it back. Go and sin no more. Not many men get paid to preach like that. Can't say the same for the others. Soldiers fresh off pay, railroad men, farmers passing through, businessmen who thought numbers made them immune to bad decisions. Those men, he kept their wages, and they kept coming. Because that's the thing about a place like that. You don't always sit down because you expect to win. Sometimes you sit down because you can't quite accept what just happened, and you'd like another chance to make sense of it. Devol understood that better than most. He didn't rush people. He let them stay. When the war ended, the country started stretching itself westward, and Devol followed along like it was the most natural thing in the world. Railroads pushed through open land. Towns appeared where there had been nothing but dust a year before. And wherever men gathered with money in their pockets, the same old habits showed up not long after. Saloons, gambling rooms, back tables tucked just out of sight. Kansas City to Cheyenne, that stretch became his new river. Different view outside the window, same game at the table. And somewhere along that line, in one of those rooms where the air sat heavy and nobody trusted the deck, he found himself in a room with a man who didn't take losing quietly. Wild Bill Hickok, years before his famous Dead Man's Hand became a legend of the felt. Devol was close enough to see how quickly a game could turn. The story's been told a few different ways, but the shape of it stays the same. Hickok sits down, places $50 on a hand, loses it, doesn't sit right with him, so he plays again. Another 50. This time, he wins. Dealer slides him back 25. Hickok looks at the chips, then at the man across from him. House limit's 25, the dealer says. Hickok takes a moment with that. You took 50 when I lost. The dealer shrugs. 50 goes when you lose. Now, there are men who argue in a moment like that. Hickok wasn't one of them. He lifted his walking stick, brought it down across the dealer's head, turned the table over like it owed him something, and helped himself to the money sitting in it. Some disputes don't wait for rules to settle them, and on those tables, that was the real tension sitting underneath everything. Not just whether a man could win, but whether the game itself was being played straight. That was always the question. Every man who sat across from him was wondering the same thing, whether they said it out loud or not. Was he just better, or was the game already leaning in his favor before the cards hit the table? Not long after, Devol found himself across from a different kind of man, a railroad director, the sort who didn't sit down expecting to lose anything meaningful. $1,200 later, that assumption had changed, and this time the consequences didn't stay at the table. The man had influence, enough to make decisions that reached beyond a single room. The outraged director responded by prohibiting gambling on his trains entirely, and gamblers like Devol started drawing attention they hadn't asked for. The Pinkerton agency took an interest, not in the game itself, but in the men who seemed to do a little too well at it. The most notorious professional gamblers within the scene, Devol prominently among them. The agency was always on the lookout, not always interfering, just keeping track. The space around the game began to tighten, slowly, then all at once. By the time Devol sat down to write his story in 1892, he'd already lived through most of it. 40 years a gambler on the Mississippi. That's what he called it. And like most men who've spent that long in one line of work, he probably shaped the telling a little, rounded some edges, smoothed out others, maybe let a few moments grow larger than they were. Hard to blame him. Stories tend to do that on their own if you leave them long enough. But by then, the world he knew was already starting to fade. Riverboats weren't what they used to be. The rail towns were settling into something more permanent. The rough edges that once made space for men like him were being worn down. And somewhere in the middle of all that, he stepped away. At his wife's insistence, they say. After all those years, all those hands, all that movement, he stopped. No dramatic ending, no final game worth telling twice, just a man deciding he'd had enough of the table. He spent his last years selling his book, not playing, not chasing, just telling. Which might be the strangest turn in the whole story. Because for a man who made his living reading others, he ended it by letting people read him. It's said he won over $2 million in those 40 years, a number that sounds different depending on how long you sit with it. Big at first, then a little less so. Because when he died in 1903 down in Hot Springs, Arkansas, there wasn't much left of it. And that's the part that stays with you. Not the wins, not the stories that get told louder than the rest, just the quiet realization that a man can spend a lifetime taking money off the table and still walk away from it with empty hands. The Mississippi River doesn't keep score or care about who wins or loses. It doesn't care about 4 sevens or a Devol butt. It just keeps moving, swallowing up everything in its path, the gold, the cards, and the men who played them. Only thing on that river that never had to cheat was the river itself. And in the end, even George Devol had to pay the house. There are plenty more stories hiding under those bright casino lights, some louder than others. If you're still here, pull up a chair. The felt's still warm.